Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of compelling sources and distill the essential knowledge and insights specifically for you.
Today, we are opening a file that is not just grim, it's genuinely terrifying.
Yeah, it really is. We're diving into one of the absolute darkest corners of American criminal history. We're looking at an individual who was active during a time that's often, romanticized, the Roaring Twenties, but also the deep misery of the Great Depression that followed.
We are. This is the story of Hamilton Howard Fish, better known as Albert Fish.
And this is a deep dive that, well, it requires a serious mental adjustment before we get into it.
It does. We're examining a man whose crimes earned him these monikers like the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and maybe the most chilling one of all, the Boogeyman.
Right.
Fish really represents this convergence of generational mental illness, deep institutional trauma, and a level of sadism and depravity that was just, frankly, unprecedented.
And we're going to be using biographical data, extensive psychiatric assessments, and his own horrifying, incredibly detailed confessions to really chart this path of destruction.
Our mission here is crucial. We need to unpack not just the facts of what he did, the monstrous acts, but also the social and psychological landscape that allowed a killer like this to operate for so long.
Exactly. Especially for anyone listening who might be less familiar with the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's so important to understand this was a time when this myth of prosperity, the American dream, often masked these deep systemic failures.
The social safety nets were, they were practically non-existent.
Right. And if you were a child of the poor or someone suffering from mental illness, the institutions available were, they were often breeding grounds for abuse, not recovery. So prepare yourself. This story is going to illustrate the terrifying cost of that neglect.
Let's begin by setting the scene. Albert Fish's origins. He was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19th, 1870.
In Washington, D.C. So this places his early development firmly in that post-Civil War era, a time of really rapid, often chaotic change and urbanization.
Exactly. And when you look at the circumstances of his birth, two facts immediately jump out that suggest trouble from the very start.
Okay.
First, his father, Randall Fish, who was a former riverboat captain, was 75 years old when Albert was born.
75. That's a huge age gap.
It is, and it's noteworthy.
Yeah.
But it really pales in comparison to the second, and I think much more crucial detail you find in the family history documents.
Which is the overwhelming evidence of a biological predisposition toward severe mental instability.
Yes. The sources outline a deeply, deeply troubled lineage. It suggests Fish was, sort of genetically loaded for instability before he ever even encountered environmental trauma.
So this was already in the family?
Oh, absolutely. The records confirm a long, severe family history of mental illness, a staggering genetic inheritance. At least 7 direct relatives were diagnosed with serious conditions. Yeah. This included an uncle who suffered from confirmed mania, a half-brother with schizophrenia, and a full brother who was actually confined to a state mental hospital.
Wow.
Even his mother experienced chronic oral and/or visual hallucinations, as the records put it. So this foundation was already just deeply fractured.
And that biological fragility then meets this seismic environmental shock when he's just 5 years old.
Yes. In October 1875, his father dies suddenly, a fatal heart attack at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. And his mother, unable to cope, places the 5-year-old boy into St. John's Orphanage in D.C.
And he stays there until 1880.
Correct. And if the family history provided the tinder, the orphanage provided the spark. It became the single defining trauma that just completely warped his development.
We really need to spend some time here because the conditions at St. John's, they weren't just harsh. They were intentionally brutal, sadistic, far beyond what you might imagine, even for a 19th century institution.
The sources make it so clear. This was less a place of charity and much more a facility of institutionalized violence. Fish himself explicitly recalled that he and the other boys were unmercifully whipped.
Unmercifully?
Yes. The staff, particularly one teacher, used this relentless public brutality. They would reportedly shred the children's clothes off, beat them severely, and use whippings as a kind of public spectacle, forcing other kids to watch.
It's a form of shame punishment designed to just break them emotionally and physically.
And here's where it gets really interesting and just profoundly disturbing from a psychological standpoint. Fish didn't just endure the pain.
No.
Which would be tragic enough. The sources suggest he internalized this abuse so completely that his mind actually began to seek pleasure from the experience.
This is the critical juncture, isn't it? This is the moment his brain chemistry starts to hardwire pain and pleasure together.
It is. Fish confessed that he began to enjoy the physical pain from the beatings. And this pleasure didn't just stop at enduring it. It morphed into full-blown sexual arousal when pain was inflicted.
So that's the root of his profound masochism.
It is. And furthermore, he was aroused by watching the ritualistic beatings of the other boys. He later stated it very plainly. He said, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong."
Wow.
The combination of shame, fear, and pain just became inseparable from sexual gratification for him.
It's just an overwhelming psychological defense mechanism, isn't it? A child faced with this uncontrollable, repeated trauma redefines it as a source of pleasure simply to survive. It turns pain into a form of power.
Precisely. And it's a profound illustration of institutional failure. The very system meant to protect him instead created the structure for his sadomasochistic development.
We also see his attempts to sort of redefine himself even back then. He was born Hamilton Howard, but at the orphanage he got the cruel nickname Ham and Eggs.
Right. And he changed his name to Albert after a deceased sibling. It was an attempt to shed the identity that was so deeply associated with that profound shame.
So around 1880, his mother manages to get him out, but by then the damage is just irreversible.
Completely. He had very little formal education. Instead, he learned manual trades, house painting, and things like that. But removing him from the orphanage simply relocated the deviance. It didn't eradicate it.
And the environmental influence just takes over.
It does. By 1882, at age 12, the sources note he was already being introduced to these severe and complex paraphilias by an older telegraph boy.
And this wasn't just minor delinquency we're talking about.
No, not at all. We are talking about behaviors like drinking urine urolania and consuming feces, which is coprophagia. He also developed voyeuristic tendencies, skeptophilia, and would haunt public baths to watch boys undress.
These are incredibly severe paraphilias manifesting so early in adolescence. It just shows this rapid descent into deeply abnormal behavior.
And we also know that Fish wasn't physically robust. He was prone to running away. He had a debilitating stutter and suffered a severe head concussion from a fall that led to chronic headaches and dizziness his entire life. So all of these factors, the biological load, the institutional abuse that fostered sadomasochism, the early exposure to profound deviance, and the physical trauma, they created what you can only describe as a psychological perfect storm.
The foundation of Hamilton Howard Fish, the person, was just completely destroyed by age 12.
And it was replaced by the twisted psychological needs of Albert Fish, the future monster.
So by 1890, Albert Fish is 20 years old and he's moved to New York City. And he's actually trying to establish a conventional adult life.
Yeah.
He marries Anna Mary Hoffman in 1898. They have 6 children.
But this conventional facade was hiding these increasingly dark tendencies.
Absolutely. The sources confirm he was engaging in male prostitution in the city and had already begun this sustained pattern of molesting and raping young boys, often under the age of 6.
And he was arrested and convicted for grand larceny in 1903. He even served time in Sing Sing prison.
So this confirms he was already living a double life, decades before he was finally captured.
It's in this period that the sexual sadism escalates from just molestation to outright torture and mutilation. And it really culminates in the horrific Thomas Bedden incident around 1910.
The Bedden case is such a crucial escalation point. It shows that his desire was moving beyond simple assault toward inflicting just profound physical damage.
That's right. Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware, when he met 19-year-old Thomas Bedden. Fish brought Bedden to an old farmhouse and then subjected him to intense sadomasochistic torture for 2 weeks.
2 weeks. And the culmination of that torture was truly shocking.
Fish tied Bedden up and then partially cut off his penis. The sources document Fish's own chilling recollection of the event, which speaks volumes about his pathology.
What do you say?
He later admitted, quote, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me. That memory of the victim's pain and horror became a cherished, defining moment for him." He only stopped and fled because he was afraid the rising heat would cause the body to decompose and draw attention before he could fully dismember it. He actually poured peroxide on the wound and left a $10 bill.
This marks the full emergence of his sadism then. The pleasure he gets from the pain and terror of others, which is distinct from his own masochism. He's now actively inflicting the same kind of profound, ritualistic shame and pain that was inflicted on him as a child.
Precisely. He's replicating the trauma in an effort to master it, and in doing so, he's creating victims who reflect his own childhood pain.
And this sadomasochism continued alongside his domestic life until 1917, when the second major life event triggers a complete psychological collapse.
Yes. His wife, Anna Mary Hoffman, left him for a handyman, and she took nearly all of their possessions with her.
The sources indicate that this abandonment, coming after decades of this internalized stress and trauma, it triggered a full psychological break. We're talking psychosis and intense hallucinations.
The abandonment was total, and Fish just collapsed internally. He started experiencing severe auditory hallucinations, often claiming he was following instructions from religious figures like John the Apostle.
The delusion was so consuming that at one point he tried to wrap himself completely in a carpet, just following a hallucinated command.
Yes, and this collapse triggered the onset of his most bizarre and enduring forms of self-harm. And this provides undeniable physical evidence of his total break from reality.
We're talking about picarism and infibulation, the self-embedding of objects.
This is where the physical details become almost unbelievable. Fish began systematically embedding objects into his own body. He lodged at least 29 large sewing needles into his groin, his abdomen, his pelvic region.
29 needles.
29. And the sources confirmed this wasn't just a passing incident. These needles were found decades later, confirmed by X-rays taken at his trial in 1935. It was concrete proof of this intense destructive compulsion.
Deliberately inserted into his own flesh over years, likely causing chronic infection and pain, all in the service of sexual gratification. It connects right back to that initial trauma at the orphanage.
It's the ultimate expression of his masochism. The continuous, agonizing pain provided the intense sexual relief he craved. But it wasn't just limited to needles.
No, he also had a nail-studded paddle that he used to beat himself repeatedly.
He did. And perhaps the most profoundly disturbing detail of his time as a single parent involves his own children in these rituals.
It is horrifying.
The source material confirms that Fish did not just perform this self-harm in secret. He would insert wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it alight.
And horrifically, he encouraged his own children and their friends, the very children he was supposed to be protecting, to participate.
He had them paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded paddle he used on himself. He was actively socializing his children into his own depravity, blurring the line between victim and accomplice in his quest for pain.
So by the 1920s, after this long, dark descent, Fish moves fully into serial murder. He becomes the boogeyman of New York. His internal world is just so fractured that external violence is now normalized for him.
And this transition was marked by a calculation alongside his psychosis. Around 1919, he had already stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, which showed the increasing lethality of his attacks. By the mid-1920s, his methods were refined and deeply strategic. And this shines a really harsh, uncomfortable light on the social prejudices of 1920s and 30s America.
What's fascinating and terrifying is his admitted method for selecting his victims. He exploited the deeply ingrained inequality of that era.
The documents reveal this cold, strategic exploitation of marginalized populations. Fish often chose people who were either intellectually disabled or critically African-American.
Why them specifically?
He explained to investigators that he assumed these people would not be missed or fully investigated by the police when he killed them. He believed these communities were disposable in the eyes of the law, which gave him a shield of invisibility.
So he wasn't just a random psychotic actor. He was systematically leveraging societal negligence and structural racism for his crimes.
Exactly. He was calculating.
Let's talk about the cases that cemented his terrifying reputation, starting with the Francis McDonald murder in 1924. This is what led to his most famous moniker, the Gray Man.
In July 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald was kidnapped from Port Richmond on Staten Island. His body was discovered hanging from a tree in a nearby wooded area.
The details were just gruesome.
They were. The boy was sexually assaulted, strangled with his own suspenders, and the autopsy revealed extensive mutilation. Disturbingly, his left hamstring had been almost entirely stripped of flesh.
And Fish later confessed he had intended to fully castrate the boy, but fled when he was interrupted.
He did. And the nickname, the Gray Man, came directly from Francis's mother, Anna McDonald. She saw the perpetrator shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself.
What was her description?
Her description stuck with the police and the press. She noted his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray.
And this image of an innocuous, shuffling old man, a figure you wouldn't look at twice, became this terrifying moniker.
The Gray Man, a ghost operating in plain sight.
Next, we have the case that truly defined the public terror. The disappearance of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in February 1927. This is what earned him the name Boogeyman.
Billy Gaffney disappeared in Brooklyn. His friend, Billy Beaton, who was with him, could only tell the police this chilling detail. He said the bogeyman took him.
Just the bogeyman took him. The community must have been paralyzed with fear.
It was, and though Gaffney's body was never recovered, Fish was later identified by a motorman as the elderly man struggling to quiet a crying, sparsely dressed boy on a trolley that day.
The ultimate confirmation, though, came years later. It came in the form of a graphic confession letter that Fish sent to his own attorney.
That letter. It reveals the full depths of his pathology. It merges sadism, mutilation, and consumption.
It's one of the most sickening pieces of criminal evidence in the 20th century.
It is. Fish claimed to have taken the young boy to a solitary location, stripped and gagged him, and then began an extended period of torture. He detailed using a homemade cat of nine tails on the boy's buttocks.
And then it escalated?
Profoundly. He described cutting off his ears and nose, slitting his mouth, and gouging out his eyes.
And the act of cannibalism wasn't just incidental, was it? It was central to his gratification. It links back to his disturbed religious delusions and his history of coprophagia and urophilia.
Absolutely. He described the process with this horrific culinary detail. He talked about sticking a knife into the boy's belly and drinking his blood.
Which is a specific perversion, hamadolania, sexual arousal from blood.
He then dismembered the body, disposing of the unusable parts but saving the parts he desired. The front of the body, the genitals, and what he called a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat.
He went on to describe making a stew out of the other cuts. The nose, ears, pieces of the face and belly, seasoned with onions and carrots.
And he concluded the description with an almost unbelievable boast. He said, "I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did."
He claimed to have consumed the entire body over about 4 days.
He did. This detailed clinical recounting of sadism, mutilation, and consumption, delivered in his own voice, confirmed that the Gray Man was truly the monstrous boogeyman. It showed his crimes were systematic, not random, and rooted in this absolute breakdown of moral and psychological function.
While the Gaffney case terrified Brooklyn, it was the murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928 that finally ended Albert Fish's long career of terror, though it took 6 more years.
Yes, and the setup for this crime perfectly exploited the profound economic anxieties of the impending Great Depression.
It was a deeply insidious approach. In May 1928, Fish, using the benign alias Frank Howard, answered a classified ad in the New York World.
The ad was placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, who was desperately looking for work outside the city to support his impoverished family.
So Fish presents himself to the family as a gentle, polite Long Island farmer, looking for a hired hand.
He does. And he quickly gained their trust, exploiting their hopes and their desperation. But his attention shifted immediately from the young man seeking work to his younger sister, 10-year-old Grace.
So he initially planned to kill Edward.
He confessed that, yes. But upon meeting Grace, he fixated on her. He played the part of a loving grandfather, brought them small gifts, and successfully persuaded the unsuspecting parents to let Grace go with him to a fake birthday party for his fictional niece.
And the family, trusting this kindly old man, dressed Grace in her finest clothes, and she was just gone forever.
He drove Grace not to a party, but to an abandoned property he had meticulously scouted out in Irvington, New York, known chillingly as Wisteria Cottage.
And his later confession detailed the crime.
It did. He manually strangled her, decapitated, dismembered, and ate most of the remains over the next several days. He told his lawyer that as he was kneeling on her chest and strangling her, he experienced 2 involuntary ejaculations.
Which confirms the sexual motivation tied to the act of killing itself, even though he later tried to minimize that at the trial.
Exactly.
6 years passed, no trace of Grace Budd. Then, in November 1934, the break comes not from a police tip, but from Fish's own compulsion to boast about his atrocity.
He sent an anonymous letter to Grace's mother, Delia Budd, who was illiterate.
Okay, let's unpack this letter because it is Fish's unadulterated, triumphant voice. It's arguably the single most compelling piece of evidence in the whole case.
He couldn't help himself. He had to relive the crime and take credit for it. The letter starts with this strange, fictionalized reference to a Chinese famine in 1894, which he used as a bizarre justification for his acquired taste for human flesh.
And then he moved directly into the horrific details of June 3rd, 1928.
He documented the logistics of the killing with chilling precision. He detailed his efforts to remain clean while performing the murder.
So he described arriving at the empty house, stripping off his own clothing to avoid bloodstains on his suit.
Yes. And when he called Grace inside, she saw him naked, became frightened, and cried out that she would tell her mother. He grabbed her, choked her to death, and then detailed the dismemberment, cutting her into small, transportable pieces. So I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it.
And the ultimate boast, mirroring his confession in the Gaffney case, focused on the consumption.
He bragged that her body was tender, specifically describing how sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. He noted it took him 9 days to consume the entire body.
It's a document that reveals pure, unadulterated, psychopathic gratification.
And despite all the explicit sadism, he included one bizarre, almost considerate detail for the grieving mother. He claimed she died a virgin, though as we know, he later admitted to his own involuntary actions during the strangling.
That letter, intended to torture the mother, ultimately contained the small, critical clue that brought him down.
It did. Because Delia Budd was illiterate, she had her son read the letter to her, and the horror immediately went to the authorities. The police focused on the stationery. It had this small, distinctive hexagonal emblem,
NYPCBA.
which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Detective William King, the chief investigator on the case, was able to trace this emblem, and it led him straight to Albert Fish's rooming house.
And when they apprehended him in December 1934, there was a brief moment of resistance.
Just for a moment, King disarmed Fish after he pulled a razor blade. Once captured, Fish immediately provided this extensive, detailed confession, confirming he was the one who killed Grace Budd and outlining his entire history of abuse, torture, and murder.
The long nightmare was finally over. The public realized the boogeyman was real.
Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began in White Plains, New York in March 1935.
And given the overwhelming physical evidence and the detailed confessions he freely gave, the legal battle really focused entirely on one concept: insanity.
The whole legal system operates on that premise of knowing right from wrong. The defense, led by James Dempsey, argued vehemently for legal insanity. They presented Fish as this deeply broken man plagued by severe psychosis.
They argued that his auditory hallucinations, which commanded him to kill children as penance for his sins, meant he couldn't rationally process the nature of his crimes.
Right, they often cited the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac as the basis for his delusions.
This trial wasn't just a criminal proceeding, was it? It was more like an unprecedented medical exhibition, cataloging a level of human depravity that forensic psychiatry had never really encountered before.
That's a great way to put it. The trial's value really lies in the psychiatric profile that was developed by the defense's chief expert, Dr. Frederick Wortham, who conducted extensive interviews with Fish.
That Wortham confirmed Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon.
He did. He said Fish possessed an extraordinary number of paraphilias, demonstrating the destructive force of his biology and his environment coming together.
We should slow down here because the sheer number of documented paraphilias, 18 separate perversions, is key to understanding his pathology. We should probably define some of these for you.
Okay. Wortham's testimony detailed a catalog of pretty much every recognized sexual abnormality of the day. We can group them into a few categories.
Let's start with the consumption-based perversions, which are maybe the most shocking aspects of his crimes.
Right. This category includes cannibalism, of course, the act of consuming human flesh. Then there's coprophagia, the ingestion of feces.
Urophilia, which is sexual arousal from urine.
And hematolenia, which is sexual arousal from drinking or observing blood. These behaviors show this regression to deeply primitive oral fixations, likely stemming from that early trauma.
Then we have the pain and mutilation perversions, which define his sadomasochistic tendencies.
Here, we see sadomasochism, pleasure from inflicting or receiving pain. Picorism, sexual gratification from piercing the skin, which we saw in his self-mutilation.
And infibulation, the self-embedding of objects, which confirms the needles in his pelvis.
Right. These were the behaviors that provided him with intense physical proof of his pathology and his gratification. The very act of cutting a victim or inserting needles into himself was central to his sexual release.
And finally, the more, classic assault and deviance perversions.
Yes, that list included pedophilia, necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, exhibitionism, fetishism, and flagellation, which is whipping.
And Wortham asserted that Fish acted upon every single one of these 18 recognized abnormalities.
He did, which placed Fish in a category of criminal that was just unique in the sources available at the time. Wortham testified that, based on this profile, Fish was profoundly insane.
His knowledge of right and wrong wasn't based on moral consensus, but was perverted by his religious delusions, where killing and consumption were rationalized as this twisted form of communion.
But here is where the trial takes a truly dark turn, and it exposes the scientific and social cynicism of the 1930s. The prosecution wanted execution at all costs, so they brought in counter-witnesses to argue that Fish was merely abnormal, not legally insane.
And one of these witnesses, a Dr. Minas Gregory, provided one of the most astonishing and frankly terrifying statements of the entire trial.
Dr. Gregory, a former manager of Bellevue Hospital and an expert witness for the prosecution, testified that Fish's severe perversions, specifically coprophilia, urophilia, and pedophilia, were not necessarily indicative of legal insanity.
His claim was just utterly shocking.
He stated that these were common perversions, that they were socially perfectly all right, and that Fish was no different from millions of other people, including successful and prominent members of society, who had the very same perversions.
Wait a minute. Are you saying a leading psychiatrist told the court that consuming feces and urine was socially perfectly all right and common among millions of successful Americans?
That is precisely what the sources report. This testimony serves one of two possible functions. One, it was a cynical and appalling corruption of science, aimed solely at ensuring a guilty verdict by normalizing his condition.
Oh, too.
And perhaps more disturbingly, it suggests a profound, unacknowledged level of deviance hidden beneath the surface of conservative 1930s American society, a darker underbelly that this trial briefly dragged into the light.
So the prosecution's objective was clear. Regardless of the medical terminology, Fish needed to be held accountable and removed from society permanently.
And they were successful. They framed it as an issue of accountability over mental health care. Despite the jury members privately expressing their belief that Fish was insane, they found him legally sane and guilty.
They sentenced him to death by electrocution. One juror later explained their reasoning.
Yes, saying that while they believed he was medically insane, they felt he should be executed anyway because of the sheer horror of his crimes and the overriding need for societal retribution.
So the legal system prioritized permanent removal over the complexities of his psychological illness.
Albert Fish's monstrous existence was rapidly brought to an end. He was scheduled for execution soon after the trial, which really illustrates the public urgency to close this dark chapter.
He was executed on January 16, 1936, at the age of 65, in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison.
And his demeanor in his final moments was chillingly passive, almost cooperative. He reportedly helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body, a final subservient act.
And his last recorded words were so strangely detached, given the life he had lived and the fate he was facing.
His final statement was reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here."
That detachment. It speaks volumes. It suggests that even in his final moment, his pervasive psychosis and delusions shielded him from the reality of his actions.
He truly may have believed he was acting as an agent of some higher power, entirely divorced from earthly justice.
There's also that persistent macabre rumor surrounding his execution that centers on the physical legacy of his self-harm, the 29 needles embedded in his body.
Right. The rumor claimed that the execution required 2 severe jolts of electricity because the metal needles in his pelvic region short-circuited the electrical apparatus, delaying his death.
And is that true?
While a witness did report 2 noticeable jolts, sources generally conclude the rumor is untrue and that he died within the standard time frame. But the rumor itself illustrates the enduring, almost mythic horror that surrounded the physical evidence of his self-mutilation.
It gave him one last bizarre claim to infamy.
It did. And following his death, his lawyer, James Dempsey, received Fish's final communication, a statement he refused to ever release to the public.
What did you say about it?
Dempsey described it only as the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read, which confirms that the core of his violent, depraved inner life remained intact until the very end.
Let's just summarize the scale of his horrific legacy, moving beyond the 3 confirmed murders of McDonnell, Gaffney, and Budd.
Fish holds a unique and terrible record. While he's confirmed to have killed those 3 children, his own claims drastically expand the scale of his depravity. He was a suspect in several other murders, including Yetta Abramowitz and Mary Ellen O'Connor.
And he claimed to have sexually assaulted or molested over 400 children.
and tortured or disfigured approximately 100 victims, almost exclusively targeting the most vulnerable, disabled, poor, and African American children because he believed they would be ignored by authorities.
He remains this terrifying case study, a man who physically carried the evidence of his own madness while executing systematic, calculated violence based on deep-seated societal prejudices.
And, as Dr. Wortham documented, the sheer volume and variety of his perversions, those 18 specific paraphilias, place him in a category of his own. He represents the absolute extreme of human sexual and psychological deviance.
A grim marker of the costs of generational mental illness combined with institutional sadism.
We have reached the end of this deep dive into the case of Albert Fish and the complexity of his existence, a product of horrific childhood abuse, severe mental illness, and a complete failure of the institutions around him is just staggering.
It really is. This case forces us to confront that dangerous intersection of nature and nurture, showing unequivocally how trauma experienced in childhood institutions like St. John's Orphanage can metastasize into unimaginable cruelty decades later.
And that profoundly cynical testimony at trial, suggesting that his extreme paraphilias were perhaps not unique in society. It forces us to question what levels of deviance were truly being suppressed or ignored behind the facade of 1930s American morality.
So what does this all mean? The fact that a man carrying 29 needles in his pelvis, who confessed to cannibalism and horrific sadism, could present himself as the harmless, polite Mr. Howard.
To gain the trust of a desperate family.
It should give us all pause about the hidden realities operating just beneath the surface of civilization.
We have detailed the 18 specific paraphilias documented in Fish's case. Considering the jury found him legally sane, despite their private belief that he was insane, and executed him at the protection of society, where does the legal line truly lie between mental illness, accountability, and the absolute need for societal retribution?
That's something for you to mull over as you reflect on this uniquely dark chapter of American history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay informed, and we'll see you next time.